Okay. All right, sounds like we're starting. Hi everyone, how are you?
Good.
Good. Excellent, thank you. The one person. Everyone else is bad, not sure. Yeah, so, okay, I hear you. All right, so my name is Yasmeen Hussain. Here to talk with you today about science in the public service. So from what I hear, this might be a little different than your other departmental seminars this semester, this quarter. I came here too, so I remember what we do. I'll have my contact info up afterwards also if you want to follow up, and I'll stay for the reception. Okay, so here are 3 things I want you to take away from this talk. One is science impacts policy, whether or not you think it does. Policy impacts science, whether or not you want it to. And there are many ways for scientists to be involved in policy. Simple messages. So let's start with why am I in this room today? So in my early career, I actually went to the University of Utah for undergrad. I did a math degree. During that process, I did some biology classes. I thought I really liked that too, so then I did a biology degree. I came out here for graduate school. And so in theory, what I did in graduate school, I was at the Department of Biology, just down that way, but I was not in the fancy new building. In fact, at some point I switched offices and my advisor said, well, don't worry, soon we'll have a new building. And good thing I didn't wait for that because I would have not graduated for a while. So I was there, I was studying how sperm and eggs find each other using chemical signaling. Sea urchins were my model. And I did some calcium imaging, microfluidic tracking, that kind of thing. But really what I did is a lot of other things. So I don't know, does this ring true to any of you? As a Department of Biology, I was doing my research, but also I was doing some science outreach. I worked with the Girls in Engineering and Math and Science program, we did Brain Awareness Week, National Lab Day. I worked in student government. So I worked with GPS, I was a representative in GPSS and served on the executive committee, went with them to Olympia for Lobby Day. I did a little bit with the union. I also took classes outside my department, and there's not too many faculty here, I think, so I think it might be safe to say that I encourage you to take classes outside your department. So I did up until my general exam, I took classes that were probably relevant to my research, right? I wanted to make sure my committee knew that I was serious about my research. And then afterwards, I had all these classes I was signing up for that were just research credits. And so I took a class or 2 in the School of Public Policy. And it's very exciting because the teachers there are very excited to have students who are not MPA students there. I also took a class with Shannon actually with Compass. So that was, I guess, through the College of the Environment, but it was on science communication for the public. And so through these things, I started learning that a lot of what I was interested in, a lot of what I was doing for fun, were things that weren't necessarily my research, right? And so I started talking to other people about what, I can say I want to go into research, and hopefully, my committee or my advisor or whoever is hiring me believes me. But your actions often belie what you want to be doing, right? And so my actions were that I really wanted to be working with people. I really wanted to be out sort of in the community. I was more interested in the impact of my work than actually doing it hands-on. And so that sort of led me into policy. In working with my committee and the research teams I had, I set it up so that I could apply for different policy fellowships and things like that, which I can tell you about later. But one of my first steps out was into the National Academies of Sciences. So I worked with the Board on Higher Education and Workforce at the National Academies of Sciences for 6 months. So the National Academies is in DC. It is not a government agency, but it is an independent sort of think tank. And they put out reports like the sexual harassment report is probably the one that's most well known that I worked on. I didn't do as much with that. I did more with some reports on graduate STEM education in the 21st century and the next generation of, supporting the next generation of biomedical and behavioral science researchers. I also worked on a workshop with on effective mentoring in sciences. And so I talked to people, my former colleagues, and they would say, wow, so what made you interested in that? You were just doing something completely different. And really, for me, it was taking a really big picture approach to the things that really affected me while I was doing my research, right? So mentoring, it's kind of a big deal. Breaking Through is all about funding mechanisms and the support that institutions provide. The graduate STEM education was about what do graduate students need to succeed. And of course, sexual harassment, right? So these are all things that were really interesting and that I sort of wanted to continue thinking about. So this is my first taste in policy, and after that I decided to continue. I was very fortunate to get a Congressional Fellowship. So essentially what that meant is that I worked with a member of Congress on the Hill for a year. In my particular case, I advised them on science and technology, education, energy, and the environment, and then I was their staff member for the Research and Development Caucus. I was running that caucus, and also worked with the House Committee on Science. And so that was sponsored by the Biophysical Society and AAAS, and it was a very interesting and eye-opening experience in government. So some things I did there are write letters. So for example, the first month I think I was there, former EPA Administrator Pruitt had decided to remove scientists from the Science Advisory Board because they had gotten grants. So the idea being that, or at least the way they put it was, if you got grants from the EPA, then you can't advise the EPA. And I thought that was really interesting, or many people thought this was really an interesting move because maybe you would be an actual good expert to advise the EPA, right? And so we wrote letters, and my boss had a really interesting platform to talk about science in policy. And so I wrote a letter, "Dear Administrator Pruitt, we're writing to express our concern about this announcement." And I'm sure Administrator Pruitt read it and said, "I am so wrong." That's why he resigned, obviously. No, but the point of these letters is to sort of set, political stances to say, or policy stances to say, this, we think this is important, or we think this is concerning or disappointing, or whatever else, from members of Congress. So we got, I think, 70 members of Congress to sign on, including a Republican. Other things I did, so I talked about the Science Committee. The fun thing about working with a member on a committee is that you can be C-SPAN famous, me being C-SPAN famous. But essentially, what I did there was, members of Congress are smart people. Surprise. No, they're smart people. That wasn't funny, I know. But they have a lot going on, right? So if you can imagine, one person may be on 2 or 3 different committees. And so part of what we would do is try and plan when they could visit some of these concurrent activities. It's like going to a conference, right? And there's like 3 different sessions running at the same time, and you want to hit like one talk from each. And so you're sort of trying to plan out your map of where you can go at the conference center. Like, how can I hit all 3 rooms at once? So it's kind of like that, except they have to vote on things and ask questions of witnesses. And so my job was to keep this smart and informed person really updated on what is happening in these hearings, or what is happening when the committee is marking up bills, like amending bills. And so I'd sit behind him and hand him notes and things like that, write questions based on our interest in a particular topic, or suggest amendments. Other things, we wrote bills. Now this is the one completely original bill I put together this year. It was on securing federal access to scientific literature. You may be surprised to learn that the average federal agency has less access to journal articles than does the average large university. Maybe that's not surprising. Universities are very well informed, but I think it's important also for like NASA to be informed, for example. And the process is, people had access to journals often when they needed them, but it wasn't super efficient, and it wasn't really clear who was getting access to what. So I worked on a bill to try and improve that, but also introduced other bills. Also did things like for the Research and Development Caucus, sort of raised awareness of different issues. So have any of you heard of the recent increase in investment in lab-grown meat, cultured meat? No? hamburger in a lab or whatever. Okay, anyway, so this is a thing that is being talked about now, including by meat producers, whether they like it or not. So we ran a briefing, the first congressional briefing on lab-grown meat, and that was really interesting. So that's the camera crew right there, they were filming it. And then we also did things like write letters for funding. So a lot of the way things get done in Congress is through funding, right? We provide funding for some program, and that really changes how things operate. So one that I was really proud of is that we asked for funding for a program to provide grants to community colleges and small universities to give their students access to childcare. So give the students directly grants to use the childcare services on their campuses. And we got a $35 million increase in funding for that program to $50 million. So that was exciting, and it looks like other people are taking this forward this year and are hopefully getting even more so that students can have access to childcare for their children. So these are a few things that one would do in Congress. But I want to go sort of bigger picture now. So this is what I did. And I was talking about how policy affects science. So how do you think, I want some audience participation here, policy affects science? And at least 3 ideas, others I'm not going to go on, so. Yes?
Funding decisions to different agencies that fund science.
Exactly, funding decisions to different agencies. Excellent. That's it? Yes?
Maybe data availability sometimes, whether there's a national data set or something like that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Data availability. Yes?
Regulation of what you can do in your science.
Yeah. Animal, yeah, no, exactly. These are perfect. Thank you. Okay, so a couple I came up with, for example, are funding, like the amount or the agency focus, conduct of research, as you just mentioned. So a couple examples of that. That's funny. Did I press back? Whatever. Anyway, the National Quantum Initiative was just signed into law this last year. So what that does is it creates a multi-agency program for multiple different agencies to have a focus on quantum information science. And it calls on NSF and Department of Energy to establish like research centers around the country to study this particular issue. Now, did it provide more funding? Not necessarily, but you would hope that there's funding bills that come afterwards that fund it. But this is sort of more the agency focus, beyond just giving money for things, saying these are the things we think are important we should do. The research, conduct of research. So National Science Foundation issued a sexual harassment policy. NIH is working on it. Different agencies are regulating conduct of research and of researchers. Okay, now how about how science is used to make policy? Now I want you to talk to maybe the 1 or 2 people next to you and come up with a couple of ways that science is used to make policy, like examples you can think of. Okay, go. I'm very strict.
Identify carbon emissions targets. Strong influence on policy there.
All right, 1 minute warning.
Say for example, priorities or funding that we determine through a project I'm sure there's some species there.
All right, so I want a few report outs here. Can we start like in this back corner here and then sort of loop around? Anything you came up with?
Well, I think we talked about using science to set like benchmarks in policy management, like air quality thresholds. I talked about fisheries thresholds.
Yeah, that's really good. That's great. Any from this trio?
I mean, we also talked about like kind of harvest quotas for managed species of fish and wildlife.
Yeah, so quotas, thresholds, things like setting limits for harmful or good things to keep around. Any from this region? You can say you didn't come up with anything, that's
We
okay
talked
too.
about biofuel standards and need for carbon neutrality and some of the biofuel regulations and how we're using life cycle models and trade models to meet the right range. That's
Yeah, life cycle modeling, regulations.
and yield control standards.
Standards. Any from anywhere on this area?
We talked about a couple of things, but for example, something like, Endangered Species Act, or just something that will inform developers or what you can and can't do in land management decisions,
Yeah. Okay. All right. Making sure everyone's heard. So I think a couple ways, like broadly, we can say that research brings awareness of problems, right? That it's like, oh, endangered species act, like we know there's this problem, but also science is referenced in formulating solutions. So you wouldn't say endangered species act with the sage grouse. You can't, you can't drain this pond or something. It's like, no, the sage grouse need these grassy hills or something instead. So the science is used in both bringing awareness to problems and also bringing solutions to them. So for example, the recent talk about PFAS, the polyfluoroalkyl compounds, contamination in drinking water. This is awareness of problems that have been brought out by scientists, saying, no, this is a big deal for public health. And then science can also be used in solutions. So we're talking about regulations, different thresholds, things like that. Washington State, it was just the Senate, the House and Senate, I think it actually got signed last week or 2 weeks ago, some energy bills, including some on like building efficiency standards, that kind of thing. Yeah, these are great, by the way. Excellent work in coming up with how science influences policy. Okay, so other kinds of questions in science influencing policy are like, what regulations should we put in place? How do we mitigate effects of natural disasters? What effects do gun laws have on safety, right? Like how do we actually assess the laws we're doing in a scientific way? And then there's this policy for science. So what research should we fund? How do we collaborate with other countries? This is a big one. Science diplomacy can be really big in environmental science, actually.
One way that policy affects science is that the NIH isn't allowed to study gun laws.
Yeah, that's CDC, NIH, yeah, exactly. There's I agree. There's a parallel there.
Gun violence.
Or I'm sure you can think of lots of other examples as well. And so hopefully this gets you thinking about how science policy is it's not separated from what we're doing, right? It's sort of all around us, both in the way we conduct ourselves in research and also in the world we live in. So what am I doing now? So I'm currently a policy analyst and program manager. I work remotely for the University of Massachusetts Medical School. I'm working on a national initiative to help institutions meet career and professional development needs of STEM grad students and postdocs. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is universities, departments, recognize there's a need to help graduate students and postdocs not only understand what career paths are available to them, but also to build skills for those careers, right? But for many institutions, this is sort of a new a new thing. It's not necessarily built into the curriculum that they've already made. And so what we're trying to do is support dissemination and implementation of evidence-based career development models. So essentially, let's say someone in Massachusetts has put together an amazing course on building project management skills. And then someone in Michigan has also put together a seminar on that for people who don't have time for a whole course. It's just a workshop. And so the idea is that all these models have validity and can be adapted to different institutions, and they also can be evidence-based, so you can assess them and see if they actually work, if they reach learning goals, that kind of thing. So there's this national initiative that is to sort of bring all those people together who are working on these problems and move the field forward to help graduate students and postdocs do well. And so I will pitch you now. So we're talking about career development, career exploration. So let's just consider this a tiny little pitch about science policy. So science policy versus academic science. So here are the similarities. You're learning new things every day. You're keeping up with the latest developments in the field, whatever your field happens to be. It might be sperm chemotaxis and sea urchins, and it might be education policy, right? Aiming to solve complex problems, complex on different scales, of course. Attending conferences and social activities that facilitate sharing ideas. That was one of the biggest things that sort of drew me into policy, was that I really loved going to conferences and sharing ideas with people, much more so than I did the work of putting together my experiments. Writing and presenting. So there's a lot of writing and presenting. You saw with some of the letters or short texts, but also emails, background information, that kind of thing. The National Academy's reports could be hundreds of pages, and the memos for a congressman could be one. So that kind of thing. And you might want to be involved in science policy if you like to work with people, if you have interest in public service, if you can use detail, but you can also see and you also prefer looking at things from the big picture sometimes. That you're interested in science. Anyone here interested in science? Yes. You want to help make decisions. I think that was one of the coolest parts of the job, is that I get to make recommendations on how a real live member of Congress could vote on things. And I could write texts that could help convince other people to do the same. And that was really exciting to me. You could be interested in being political, but you don't have to be political. There's a lot of discussion about how policy and politics interact. And I will be very honest with you, I don't have a great definition off the top of my head. But policy is more about the actual policy, the actual things that are being done to sort of change things. And politics is more convincing others, doing the persuasion part, sort of talking to stakeholders, that kind of thing. And you might want to keep your day job, or you might not. So you could get involved in science policy as someone who's working directly in a federal government or state government, or an advocacy group, or you could be an expert in your own field and do some work with science policy in your own time. And so that are all the slides I had. So I guess we went through that kind of quickly. But that leaves a lot of time for questions and also for more discussion. So let's open it up. Thanks. Yeah.
What did you feel like was the biggest challenge or hurdle to jump through going from I know you took some classes, but going from a very science-heavy PhD to have a policy oriented?
It's a good question. Biggest challenges. The transition was actually really fun for me. But I think one thing that I didn't expect was that people's communication methods are really different and the timelines are really different. So, for example, especially in the Congressional Office, the National Academy is a little bit more academic, but in the Congressional Office I had like 2 phones, and I'd be getting emails on one and texts on the other from like the same people, and I was supposed to respond to those. like at the same time, and that was just kind of blowing my mind in terms of how deadlines work here, right, or how events work here. Or also, I expect it to be pretty formal with communications, right? You're talking with important people who have responsibilities, and actually it was really the opposite. Instead of writing like emails that were dear and sincerely or whatever else, like the whole topic or the whole point of the email was just in the subject line, and it was just, that was it, that was the whole email. So that was really surprising, and I think can hit a lot of people in the face if they go directly in, right? I had a nice transition going through the National Academies first. I think another thing that's surprising is the way you get credit. So here you have authorship, right? In the Academy you have authorship, and everything we do has hopefully our name on it, otherwise that's not good, right? But there it's really very much the opposite, in that the people you're working for are often ranking at a point where, how should I say this? They're a great mouthpiece often for the words you have, but you don't necessarily get credited in that. I think that can surprise a lot of people in the movement too, right? So I write a speech for someone and they're not gonna be like, and thank you, Yasmeen, for writing this speech. Anyway, so here's what I was gonna say. Like, it just, the pride you get, the credit you get is just knowing that you wrote this speech for this person and they gave it on national television or something. So I think those are two things that are, I guess, big differences. Yeah, I think I expected to be more thrown off by the politics. But for me personally, that didn't end up being a big problem. I hope that answered your question.
So you talked about getting into this and how it was one of the things that you were sort of doing anyway. Maybe you were sort of drawn maybe away from the bench or away from your science towards interacting with people. It sounds kind of extroverted, right? I'm watching you, I'm seeing a fair amount of extroverted activity, right? But not all scientists are like that.
Sure.
Some really kind of pull away. Is there a role for the introvert?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that, because I think that is, when I said work with people, I guess what I mean is you kind of have to be okay with being in a team, because everything is done in a team, or like you have to work with stakeholders. But I think there's actually a really great place for people who are, I guess you would say, introverted, if you are into Myers-Briggs, or if quieter, or just aren't comfortable like public speaking in a crowd or whatever else. And there's lots of different roles in science policy. So I just did two. And some of those roles, for example, at the National Academies, a lot of what I did was I didn't do any like public speaking or anything else. I did sort of background research, and that's funny, why did I go from research to research? It's a different kind of research. I would sort of go through the archives of National Institutes of Health rules and say, try and pick out where things had changed based on other people's recommendations. And there are lots of people who work as sort of policy researchers or in sort of think tanks type situations where you do get to spend that time sort of thinking about things, going into the details. You work with a team usually. And then there's roles for people who are, on the other side of the spectrum, I'd say, are roles for people who are very gregarious, who are very interested in being with the crowd, and that's like lobbyists, right, or people who are advocates. And they're like, I'm gonna go talk to 100 members of Congress and their staff today, and I'm so excited. And like, actually, that really hits the limit. Like, it was surprising for me that somewhere in DC, like here, when I was at UW, I think there were a lot of times where I was like, oh, I wish I could be like interacting with people. And there actually hit some limits. There's one day I was like, I don't think I can talk to anyone else. I'm not gonna make it, because there'd be so many meetings and so many social events, and it would just be a lot. So I think, in a short answer, there's roles for lots of different people in policy, both on the scale from super gregarious to would prefer not to talk to anyone today, and also on the scale of really interested in the big picture to really interested in the details. Because there are people who are needed sort of on all sides, right? So the people who wrote the appliance efficiency standards, you want those people to be like, yes, so this kind of washing machine like this is the kind of threshold we need, right? Or the people who write the standards for all sorts of things. Whereas maybe someone from an advocacy group on environmental justice, like that may not be super useful skills for that to go into a member of the legislature's office and like walk them through the nitty gritty, but you'd really want them to like speak to the big picture and how this affects their community. Did I answer your question?
Oh, that was great, thank you. I can imagine somebody out there thinking, oh, I can't imagine myself doing something.
No, that's a good point. That's a good point.
So, in some of my work, translating science policy, sometimes talking with colleagues in the academy, the term comes up, oh, you're dumbing it down. Because our writing in science is often very detailed, elaborate. You have to tell the full story of your data, collection, analysis, and so on. And I know it's not dumbing it down by any means. Could you speak to that a little bit about writing content and style in these two different worlds?
That's a great question. Thank you. So the question is about writing content and style for academic versus policy, and it's not dumbing it down, but what makes the difference? I guess. So did I get the question right? So I think the big thing for writing for policy, well, there's two big things. One is to focus on the why. So I guess, for example, if we are writing a scientific paper, we start with the background, right? And we're like, here is all the stuff that people have done before us, and here is the body of literature leading up to it, and then we say, here's what we did, and then you're like, here's what we got, and then the discussion's the end, right? It's like, here's why we did it, here's why it's cool, and all that. In policy, it's kind of flipped, right? Where you start with, like I would write memos, for example, and you would start with, here's my recommendation, here's what you should do. And then you give some background. You're like, here's some backup for why I think you should do that. And then you follow it up again with, again, here's why I think you should do this thing. Here's maybe the second best option and why you might choose that. So the why is really big, and having an action item or a recommendation or a message or whatever else is really, really critical. Whereas in academics, you can say, oh, we hope to follow up on this, or we think there should be more research, but it's not like a call to action, right? I think the other big thing is ensuring that you're getting across what's important for your audience. Now that might sound like really simple, right? But actually, we have some time. Okay, so we'll do a fun activity. Okay, the idea being you want to explain something that you care about. It doesn't have to be your research, because I know not everyone does research that's necessarily directly applicable, but explain something you care about that you think is like really complicated, that other people think is complicated. It could be ballet techniques, or it could be your research, to the person next to you, and make sure that they're a person who doesn't know anything about it, and that they will care about it. Like, give them something to care about. So just try it. I'll give you like 2 minutes. Did I give you any clear instructions? No? Okay, so what you want to do is you want to turn to the person next to you or your trio, and each person gets 1 minute, so it could be 2 to 3 minutes, I'll time you. And tell them something you're really excited about and think they should care about, and why they should care about it. Sound good? Okay, go. It's 4:05, maybe 4:08.
I'll tell you about the awesome statistical models used to counsel. And really, I mean, super rare. I feel like every day I Google alerts, I get something with a headline. It's like, world's rarest cats came for the first time. And bottom line is we don't actually have any idea how much shit think of their data as basically just because of all of that, that's what spots that we can recognize
So actually, that's great. That bring it full circle. What tactics did you use to convince? Well, what did you convince someone of, or what did you convince her of?
So I do work in urban greening and human health response. And we talk about how children at schools with green schoolyards perform better, higher graduation rates, and there's a variety of green situations that encourage those outcomes.
So what really convinced you about that argument? I'm putting you on the spot,
Yeah,
so sorry about that.
I mean, I think it just relates to my own experiences. So, like, I feel like everything she was saying I could relate to, and then it made sense to me in terms of what I want during my education. Yeah, which kind of brings me to another question I have for you, but...
Okay, hold that thought.
Yeah.
Awesome. Did you have any convincing in this category? I know we haven't heard from anyone on this side before. Did you convince each other of anything? No?
Well, my example, I tried to convince Jenna that we should push to force people in the entertainment industry to at least put water in their cups in any TV show or movie because they're clearly almost empty, and they like lift it and it's just obvious that it's empty and they tip it back, and it's so just upsetting and unconvincing.
Yeah, that's a big issue.
And it bothers people who are detail oriented, and I think it bothers people who aren't detail oriented because you just know it's inauthentic, you know. And so I think just how worked up I got about it convinced Jenna.
So Jenna, were you
If it had good content.
passion? Okay. Yeah. So you're actually both of you pulled on something really critical here, which is passion. So you don't necessarily in academia we want to be really, really straight faced, right? We're like, this is exciting. We think. Police think it's exciting too, right? In policy, you can actually say, I strongly believe this. I think it's important. And it's actually welcome. It's important to do that. And then you were saying that it relates to your life, right? So it's hard sometimes to frame the things we care about in relation to other people's lives, and you apparently did a good job of relating to here's something you might care about, and here's why you find it in common. So I think one thing. So we did this exercise with some students in a technical writing class, or electrical engineers. I asked them to explain like Wi-Fi. And I was like, use just common words, like don't use any technical words. And they're like, I can't find a substitute word for antenna. I was like, well, does antenna matter, right? Like, are you actually taking every word and making it simpler? Or do you want to make your message simpler? Does antenna matter to this? Does the word greening matter? Does any jargon we use matter to the message? Or do we want to think, what does our audience care about? How can I explain to them that it's important? And how can I use language that is clear for people who are not in my field? Did that answer your question at all?
Oh, yes.
Oh, good. And so you had a follow-up question to that.
Yeah, well, so kind of multiple things. Like, I felt like she convinced me because of possibly my background and where I'm coming from, and I felt like your presentation was very like rosy about science influencing policy, and I feel like at Congress or senators, there's probably not, or there's a group that may not come from a similar background, and hopefully there's diversity there. So I guess my question is more about then, as science influences policy, when they might not listen to you, or they may spin your science in a way that you don't want it spun. Like the frustrations there, and did that happen to you, and how did you overcome that during your experience?
That's a good question. So basically, how did you overcome science not necessarily being integrated into it, and like maybe more the political side of things and frustration? Yeah.
As an example, I just read an article today about how scientists are trying to counterspin the anti-vax messaging, which was a misinterpretation of some bogus science, I'll just say. So anyway, maybe that's an example. How do you counter what becomes embedded in their culture?
Right. I mean, it's a big question. And I think if we knew the answer, it'd be like, bam, we're done. This is easy. I think one big thing I learned, and that was helpful for me, because when I was working in Congress, I was working with a Democrat, and the Democrats were in the minority in the House. So, meaning Republicans were in charge of all the things, chaired all the committees, all of that, and we were sort of at a political disadvantage in terms of making things happen. So it was a really interesting perspective in terms of like, how do you convince people? Because you're like, can we get a Republican on anything? So I think one big thing was sort of this thing that came up earlier in our activity, which was finding commonalities. So we, for example, would go to a Republican lawmaker who's been like super excited about space or something. And we're like, this thing that we're proposing, this would really help with the space that we're talking about. You were excited about this, we're excited about this, can we be mutually excited about this? And I was surprised, I guess I'm painting a rosy view. A lot of things didn't work. A lot of things we didn't get anywhere. But I was surprised at how much people did try to compromise, even when they didn't have to, right? Like, I think most of the people I met the last couple of years in DC really do care about the world. They just have all these different inputs, I guess. So like the data from research may be one input, but there's also an input of their constituents. So let's say you think, the data from BLM is like, yeah, these wild horses, like their population's kind of exploding and this is like a hot button issue, or has been for a while. And we really need to like cull some herds or whatever. But then your constituents are calling like 10 times a day. Hundreds of people are calling you and they're like, don't kill any wild horses, don't do it. And they're passionate enough about this that, and you're supposed to be representing these people, right? I mean, you can look at it cynically and say, someone who's elected has to get reelected. You can also look at it, they're elected to represent people's views in their district. And so if all the people in the district are like, don't kill the wild horses, and the BLM is like, we should probably kill some wild horses, then they have this conflicting view, right? And sometimes you have to sort of choose what battles to fight or whatever else. But people do really care and also compromise. I mean, there were Republicans we worked with on the committee, the science committee, who would come over and ask for our buy-in on things, would ask for amendments, and they didn't necessarily have to. I mean, they could have voted everything through. No one would have been happy, and it wouldn't have looked good on paper or speeches or whatever else, but it could have happened. So sort of getting back to your question, which is how did you cope with it? I guess I sort of went in with, at some point you develop like this sense of humor where you're like, I wonder if anything good will happen today. And sometimes it does, and it's very exciting, and then sometimes you just make incremental progress, or you set things in the ground. So for example, the congressman I worked for had worked on getting the Office of Technology Assessment reinstated. So essentially what that was is an office that the Congress had that is a science advisory office, basically, of experts who would think across different fields. They wrote stuff back in the 90s about electronic health records, and like it wasn't even a thing yet. And they were like, we should really implement this. And then this office got canceled or removed from the government during Newt Gingrich's time in 1995. Anyway, lots of history. But the point is, this office has been uninstated for a while. There's been this push for the past 10 years or so to get it reinstated. So I introduced a bill with my boss last year to try and do it. We introduced amendments to funding to get funding for it. Nothing was really happening because of the political climate. But then this year, when Democrats took the House, they put $5 million for this office in the funding bill. So the things we do, policies are really a long game, right? Like sometimes you go to people and you're like, the Arctic, we need not drill in it. And they're like, that's nice. And then the Arctic, we're not drilling in it. And they're like, eventually you get someone or you get something. And then it's like, oh, okay, over the decades you see that it's kind of worth it. So this is a really long answer to your question. Did I give you some hope?
Yeah.
or explanation of why I have hope. Like I actually left DC feeling more hopeful about the state of government than I had going into it.
See, I left the opposite because I was a Knaus fellow.
Oh yeah.
And then, yeah. So
Interesting. No, yeah, so tell us about your experience.
Well, it just, I don't know. So I was working at NOAA headquarters. And I guess I did have some optimism in terms of what I was doing with the Endangered Species Act, but then some of the higher ups at NOAA were still going to congressional hearings and spinning the science in a way that I know is not what they were being briefed on. Like, they were just picking and choosing what they wanted to say. So then, like, maybe there is hope there that those seeds are planted, but at this point, it just, like, doesn't seem like it, because they're just taking whatever they want to say and saying it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's a really interesting experience from an agency's perspective. Because I didn't work in an agency, right? So, and there is this interesting clash of working with people or advising people whose beliefs don't necessarily mesh with yours, right? So that's a really interesting experience. I'd love to hear more about it. I know you look familiar, but yeah.
So what experiences did you pull from your hard science PhD to sort of make that transition into policy? And asking because sometimes, women apply to things and I have none of the qualifications. I did cell science. How am I going to make this jump? What do I say? So how did you navigate that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Okay, so what experiences sort of, so from the actual research side, one big thing was learning to read stuff quickly and get the important information from it. So reading the paper or whatever and getting whatever method you need, or reading through 100 pages of witness testimony for a hearing and trying to figure out what question to ask them. It's the same skills from that. So I think when people talk about reading, writing, presentation, picking up things quickly, that is all in that realm. What else? Being sort of resourceful, and I don't know about you all and your graduate experiences, but there are a lot of times when you have no idea how to get information about something, or there's a thing in a paper and it's just not working, and you have to kind of wander the building or I called someone in my PhD, I called someone who had written a paper in the 80s and they were still alive, and I contacted them and I was like, can you tell me? What I mean was they were a PI on a paper a long time ago. Sorry. That ageism is real, and I don't want to. Basically, it was someone who had written something a long time ago, and they were still available and at the university to be able to answer my question, which I was pleased by. And they were like, "How did you even find me?" And and so it's this being resourceful and calling around, because there were a lot of times when there would be bills or something that I had no idea about, and they were very much outside the realm of my expertise. And I think you all, or we all, learn how to deal with things that are outside our expertise, because that's all you're doing, right? And try and become an expert in something. And then being effective under pressure, right? We have, conferences, presentations, or general exams, or whatever else, where you have to come up with answers you don't really know, and you're good at saying, here's what I don't know, here's what I do know. Here's what I think is best, and sort of that decision-making skill. Also in my lab, I think I took on a handful of administrative roles, hiring people, supervising, that kind of thing, and not necessarily for policy, but for translatable skills generally, managing the lab's, cleanup tasks or whatever else. Those are all things, and writing grants, being persuasive in your writing. So I've named things in no particular order, but that's a few ideas offhand. Cool. Sorry about the dig. It was not on purpose, and I apologize. Shall we break for some more informal conversation? All right. Thank you so much. You've been awesome.